Okay, so picture this. How do you take an absolute disaster of a 19th century military blunder and turn it into a maximum mark exam answer? If you're studying conflict poetry, you already know that cracking the mechanics behind a poem is basically a cheat code for top grades. Today, we're tearing down a classic text to give you the exact toolkit you need to literally wow any examiner.
Welcome to this explainer. We're digging into Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. Now, Tennyson was a massive deal in the Victorian era, and this piece is arguably one of the most famous bits of war literature ever written. But to grab those top-tier marks, we can't just talk about guys on horses. We've got to unpack the gritty context, the rigid structure, and the very deliberate language. All right, here's our game plan for today. First, the context of the blunder. Then, form, structure, and rhythm. After that, language of the battlefield. And finally, comparing conflict poetry. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The context of the blunder. Let's ground this in historical reality.
So to really get this poem, you've got to understand the Crimean War. It kicked off in 1853 over a religious dispute, and by March 1854, Britain and France had declared war on Russia. But honestly, from day one, this whole campaign was an absolute logistical nightmare. The tipping point came in October 1854 at the Battle of Balaclava. A catastrophic miscommunication meant lightly armed British cavalry on horseback charged headfirst into heavily armed Russian artillery. Yeah, not good.
And the thing is, the public found out about this mess pretty quickly, mainly because it was the first modern war with civilian correspondents sending news back home. The phrase, "someone had blundered," actually comes straight from a leader in the Times newspaper calling it a hideous blunder. Tennyson snatched that exact phrase to bridge the gap between the chaotic mismanagement by the upper classes and his own poetic retelling.
Here is the absolutely crucial point you need for your essays: Tennyson's job. As poet laureate, he wasn't just some rogue artist. He was literally part of the establishment. He was duty-bound to glorify the war for the British public and really to cover for the aristocratic leaders who were getting roasted in the press. Talk about a tough gig. He had to acknowledge the horrific reality of the mistake, but ultimately spin this unquestioning obedience into a glorious, heroic sacrifice for the nation.
Moving on to Section 2. Form, structure, and rhythm. Let's look at the literal framework here.
The poem starts in medias res. Drop that term in your exam, examiners love it. It means starting smack dab in the middle of the action. By opening with half a league, Tennyson literally thrusts us, totally unprepared, right into the middle of a cavalry charge. It instantly creates this tense, breathless atmosphere, forcing us to experience the poem through a lens of immediate threat and unstoppable momentum.
Now, check out the meter. Dactylic dimeter, basically 2 stressed syllables per line, each followed by 2 unstressed ones. Try saying it out loud. Dum-da-da, dum-da-da. It's brilliant, right? This unrelentless, falling rhythm sounds exactly like the physical pounding of galloping horses thundering down the valley. But hey, it goes deeper. That falling rhythm also mirrors the devastating, inevitable fall of the British Brigade itself, and the soldiers' blind, unstoppable obedience to their orders.
Structurally, we're looking at a ballad. Historically, ballads were used to pass down important stories orally and memorialize events for future generations. Mentioning this structural choice proves you understand Tennyson's ultimate goal. He was building a lasting public monument to the fallen soldiers, making sure their sacrifice was remembered as a heroic tragedy rather than just an embarrassing political screw-up.
All right, Section 3. Language of the battlefield. Let's dissect the flesh and blood of the text.
Let's zoom in on the language. That relentless repetition of distance. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. It does 2 huge things. First, it highlights just how incredibly far they had to ride under heavy fire, exposing their absolute vulnerability. But secondly, it perfectly illustrates the awful repetitionness of the battle and the total lack of ground actually gained. It's like a tragic treadmill, creating this intense pack mentality as the 600 move as one doomed unit.
And this is where we see how authority really operates in the poem. Look at these commands. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns. The imperative verbs here are so important because they show the soldiers literally had zero choice. Their autonomy is gone. Despite staring obvious death right in the face, the strict military hierarchy dictates they have to march forward. No questions asked.
Which brings us to arguably the most famous stanza. Notice the heavy use of anaphora, repeating a word or phrase at the start of successive clauses. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Wow. This hammers home their complete lack of individualism. It underscores a massive theme, absolute obedience to command. And remember, in Victorian England, that kind of obedience was seen as a highly desirable, noble trait, even when the command itself was fundamentally broken.
You absolutely have to bring up the Valley of Death. This is a massive biblical allusion to Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. But here, it is deeply, darkly ironic. In the psalm, God is there protecting the speaker. In the Crimea, the upper-class military leaders completely failed to protect these lower-class soldiers. They're sentenced to the valley without a shepherd, just totally surrounded by hellfire.
Also, take a look at how Tennyson handles the actual violence. He leans heavily on euphemisms. Instead of giving us the graphic, gory truth of artillery ripping through human bodies, he softens the blow for his cozy Victorian readers back home. He uses phrases like horse and hero fell. Notice that soft, breathy alliteration? It completely masks the brutal reality of the slaughter. He's the poet laureate, right? He has to maintain the glory, not traumatize the home front.
Finally, Section 4. Comparing conflict poetry. This is where you synthesize for those top marks. A killer comparison to make is with Ted Hughes's bayonet charge, where Tennyson praises blind obedience, literally asking when can their glory fade. Hughes directly challenges that whole perception of honor. He shows a soldier dropping lofty ideals like king, honor, human dignity in a split second of pure terror. Tennyson uses that dactylic dimeter for a fast, glorifying pace, whereas Hughes creates this chaotic, panicked, irregular rhythm. And while Tennyson's critique of leadership is super subtle and wrapped in patriotism, Hughes is explicitly calling out the propaganda that throws men into the meat grinder.
Another fantastic contrast is Wilfred Owen's Exposure. Both poets actually share a subtext criticizing military leadership. Tennyson slips in someone had blundered, while Owen's soldiers are worried by silence, realizing the whole war is basically futile. But the execution is night and day. Tennyson gives us an active, kinetic, blazing cavalry charge. Owen? His soldiers are entirely static, freezing to death in the mud, isolated, and completely abandoned by the authorities that put them there. And if you want a brilliant contrast in scale, look at Simon Armitage's Remains. Tennyson crafts this grand, historical, third-person narrative to commemorate collective valor on a giant stage. Armitage flips that completely, giving us a modern, first-person, deeply psychological account. Remains zooms in intensely on the lingering aftermath, the post-traumatic stress of a single soldier, which is a world away from a sweeping celebration of a noble 600.
So, having cracked open the context, that rigid meter, those strategic euphemisms, and the subtle ironies, I want to leave you with one final provocative question for your exam conclusion. Does Tennyson, playing the good poet laureate, truly glorify the Light Brigade? Or, and think about this, hidden within those galloping dactyls and ironic biblical allusions, is this poem actually a brilliantly disguised charge against the very leaders who blundered and sent those men to die? Nail that argument, and those top marks are absolutely yours. Keep analyzing, and I'll see you in the next explainer.